probably one of the most devastating things that mothers can think is, I think my baby hates me, and that's why he's crying. What am I going to do? I waited and waited for this baby, and now this baby hates me. It's amazing how many times mothers have confessed that. One of the things I want to just address right up front is this. That is not true. Your baby loves you more than anybody in the world. That's why your baby's shouting out for you. Your baby knows your smell, your sound, the feel of your body. Your baby wants you. Baby loves you more than anybody else in this world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Science Chick Report. I'm Ken Tackett, Managing Director for Praeclarus Press. This is part one to a series we are doing this summer addressing some of the key issues for new mothers and the providers who help them. I'd like to welcome Dr. Kathleen Kendall-Tackett to today's Q&A.
Hi, thanks very much for having me, Ken.
All right, let's get into it. Okay, my first question is pretty obvious. Is crying a big deal for new mothers?
Oh, it absolutely is. We find actually crying can be, one of the more difficult and challenging things to deal with because all of a sudden, especially, we have so many of our new moms who are by themselves for long periods of time, and being there all day by yourself with a crying baby is really hard. Crying by itself is a signal. Babies need to actually signal help, but it's really meant to be noxious. It's meant to be something that will get people's attention and will get people to come. So it's kind of like a fire alarm. It's kind of like a smoke detector. It's meant to be something that's just there and irritating and you can't just ignore. Okay, so listening to that is hard. And it's hard to sometimes figure out when you're kind of in those early days what's wrong, and that just makes you feel really helpless. And not surprising, mothers, we found some kind of early studies where mothers who had crying babies, whose babies who cried a lot during the day, were more likely to be depressed. So crying is a huge deal. But we want to kind of see if we can kind of work through this in a way that's both compassionate to mothers, and empowering for them, but also compassionate toward the infants because, they can't help it. They're not trying to manipulate anybody. They don't know how to do that. Okay. They only know they've got this one signal. And say, so we want to kind of help moms, in that situation where they're having a tough time, and make it a little bit easier for them.
All right, so what can mothers do?
Well, I think one of the most important things is we want to kind of start figuring out, what's going on, and I think this can be challenging in the beginning because we start thinking with kind of our emotional brain. We start thinking, well, what's wrong? What's wrong with me? Why can't I make this baby stop crying? And then, sometimes you get relatives that chime in too. And I think this is particularly hard when you got a breastfeeding mom, because then everybody's got an opinion and a thought. Well, you know what? It must be breastfeeding. You must be doing it wrong. And so they've got all these opinions and thoughts and everything about this. So you've got this almost like Greek chorus in the background, and then you start doubting yourself, and I think probably one of the most devastating things that mothers can think is, I think my baby hates me. And that's why he's crying. And he cries every time I try to pick him up. And what am I going to do? I waited and waited for this baby, and now this baby hates me. And it's amazing how many times mothers have confessed that. They really think that. And I think one of the things I want to just address right up front is this. That is not true. Your baby loves you more than anybody in the world. That's why your baby's shouting out for you. Your baby wants you. Your baby knows your smell, your sound, the feel of your body. Your baby wants you. Baby loves you more than anybody else in this world. Okay, so what we're going to try to do is now figure out why they are signaling and what kinds of things that we can do that might make that better.
All right, so what are some major causes of crying?
Well, I think there's three we were going to kind of, talk about. The first is, feeding. I think feeding is a big one. And, obviously, especially when you have a breastfeeding baby, we want to kind of make sure, with formula, it's a little more straightforward in that you measure and, you have schedules. And so from that perspective, they're probably getting enough food. But it's a little trickier with breastfeeding because sometimes you don't know. And that's not really something that's on the mother's fault. That is largely a provider problem. Because what happens is that a lot of times providers don't know. And we've had some really high profile tragedy cases where a mother had a baby that was crying and crying and crying constantly. And she was going to all these providers and they kept saying, oh, your latch looks fine. Keep doing what you were doing. Turns out baby wasn't getting anything to eat, and so the baby was crying and she thought it was a good sign when the baby suddenly stopped crying. But the baby at that point was in serious medical difficulty. So again, we want to make sure that the baby's getting enough to eat. So how can moms and their helpers know that? Okay, there are ways we can know that. First of all, you want to look, on the mother side and helper side, when a baby finishes a feed, does he look satisfied? And we look for this thing we call milk drunk, where they kind of come off the breast and they just look so happy and they're just so, a lot of times they got a little milk dribbling out. It's adorable. Okay, so that's one thing. It's like, are they satisfied at their feeds? And of course, kind of the gold standard is, are they gaining weight? And that's a big one. Now, what I'm going to recommend is sometimes people get all worried in the hospital, because a baby might have a sharp weight drop. Well, if a mother's gotten a lot of fluid during labor, like all of a sudden the baby's like weight's going to drop too because they get that fluid too. And so the first couple of good pee diapers and all that weight drops. So it's really the 24-hour weight, so when we're kind of watch. But from there, you should be going up and only up. Okay, so if you see a baby that's steadily gaining weight, the baby's getting enough to eat. And it's kind of like, does the baby seem settled? Does the baby seem like they're full at the end of a feeding, or are they fussy? That doesn't necessarily mean they're not getting enough to eat. And is the baby gaining weight? Okay, so those are the things that really kind of can give us that. And that's something, to watch out for. We can have the helpers. It doesn't mean you have to sit there and neurotically look at that every single time, because honestly, you make yourself crazy. But you also want to know too, is it comfortable to breastfeed? Because if it isn't, sometimes, even though people tell you your latch looks fine, it's hurting, and we're going to talk about pain in another session. But sometimes that can be an indication that the baby isn't getting enough to eat. But I think that's the first place to look. Okay, so if we've eliminated that, then Ken, what is the next thing we want to look at?
Pain.
Okay, so if you think about what happens to a baby during birth, okay, you can kind of think about this, what would happen to you if you went through this. Now, you can think about the baby's skull, at the time that they're delivered is very malleable, and for a really good reason. Okay, so you got all these kind of plates in the cranium, and they're malleable and they've got to squeeze through this little tiny surface to get through. And sometimes they're dragged out, and sometimes they're suctioned out, and sometimes there's a really rough delivery and they break the baby's clavicle or their collarbone. I've heard of cases where they've broken the baby's arm, but I think even just with a normal vaginal delivery, sometimes just all those skull bones might just be a little out and they're really, really painful. And so one of the things that can really be helpful, and you might think, oh my gosh, I'm not doing this, this is crazy. But I'm going to say, maybe go think about trying to find a provider to do it once, because I think you're going to find once is going to be enough. There's this thing called cranial psychotherapy, and they can actually kind of very gently move those head bones back to where they go. And it's amazing. And I have to say, the evidence on it, honestly, is kind of mixed because energy psychology is a little bit hard to measure. But I will tell you this, I've had personal experience with this. I was in a car accident where I also had a head injury, and I was getting these very, very, very sharp pains in kind of the roof of my mouth, and they go up back behind my eye. And there was nothing you could do to help. But I thought, I bet those little bones are out of whack. Sure enough, one session of cranial sacral, and it worked. Now, I'm the first one to say it, tried it and it worked. Is not evidence. It's not, but it's something that you might consider because that is something that could be a source of pain. But also something that we do have a lot of evidence for is infant chiropractic. And Joyce Miller has done a ton of research on this. There have been all these randomized trials. It's been very, very, very effective for babies who cry a lot. 1 to 2 sessions, baby stop doing it. Because again, things can get really out of joint. If you watch like a video of a baby being delivered by C-section, they're yanking on the baby's head. How can that not result in some kind of soft tissue injury? I mean, seriously. And same thing with when they're pulling the baby out of the birth canal, that can be very difficult. So, it's worth a shot. I'm saying, you're not going to be in there long term. It's not going to be something that's going to go on forever. 1 to 2 appointments, you're probably good to go. So these are things that take a look. And also too, if they've got like, say, like a big bruise on the top of their head, just be mindful of that. Maybe put some arnica on the top of that, help with the bruise. Maybe there's certain positions that aren't comfortable because of the way they were sort of yanked out. So a lot of times you can kind of, if you start thinking about, okay, what seems to be a position that's comfortable versus not? A lot of times you can kind of work around that. If it's not comfortable for the baby to be laying crossways, you can actually kind of put them in front of you. You can lean back and have the baby face down on you, put the cheek on the breast, do the laid back breastfeeding. So try to think about kind of different positions that are comfortable. And the baby's going to let you know right away, are they comfortable or not? So again, if we start thinking about what can we do to help manage their pain, I think you're going to find that's another thing to just kind of rule out. Okay, so the final thing is a little more complicated, and that's temperament. Back in the day, they used to think babies all had the same personality, which was none. Okay, and so temperament became a huge area of study. It really started seeing a lot of articles like in the 1960s. And they sort of narrowed down, the kind of these three temperaments, these sort of easygoing, and there was kind of one that was sort of more in the middle, and then there was the difficult. And those kids were like about 10% of the population. And they tended not to react well to change, they tended to be more sensitive. Now, I personally actually don't like the name difficult because I think that implies that they're trying to be difficult, and they just don't have the brain power for that kind of cognitive thinking. They don't have it. And so, I actually prefer, high needs, high sensitivity. I think that's a more accurate name. So again, kind of pay attention. Are there things that kind of make your baby more uncomfortable? Like if there's a lot of noise in the room, or if a lot of different people are holding your baby. These are things that can kind of overstimulate some of these babies with these high sensitivities. It may be that full on skin to skin is a little too much. So maybe just do a little bit, cheek on the breast, everything else is covered. But try to think of things that can soothe. And this is where bringing in your helpers can be really great. Have your partner, have your mom, walk the baby around in a soft carrier. Some people find that the car is very soothing. Some people find putting the baby in their carrier on top of the washing machine, some kind of rhythmic motion. So kind of experiment, see what kinds of things seem to be soothing. Okay, so that actually kind of, leads to some other questions about it. Kind of like, how do we do this? What are some of the things? Now, Ken, I know you were going to ask me a question about allergy. Did you have the question about that?
Yes, allergies. Are they often a cause of crying?
Some people think they are, and I think there are kids that are allergic. I said the only caution I would put here is when you start going on these extremely strict elimination diets, especially for breastfeeding moms, and you find that you're having to cut down. And I mean, I talked to one mom, I swear she was on eating nothing but practically celery and water. I mean, her elimination diet was so strict. But I'd say try and experiment, see what happens if you stop having dairy. It might take a day or so for it to clear from your milk, but see if it makes it better. Because dairy and wheat are kind of the two of the big culprits. Some babies react to peanuts. And so those are kind of the ones I would try at first. Do them one by one, kind of elimination, and see which one makes a difference. And, that could be something. But again, sometimes we do all this stuff to quote, treat, um, treat allergy, and it turns out it's not an allergy. But those would be, so I would say, it's worth it. It's worth a look. I said my youngest son was actually pretty allergic to dairy, and every time I tried to have a little pat of butter, he'd cry for the next 4 hours. So, for a period of time, I had to avoid it. But then by about 9 months, he wasn't allergic to it anymore. So it is worth checking that. I think that is one good thing. So, Ken, what are some other things that might be an issue?
How about colic?
Well, this is kind of an interesting thing because this is a question people say. They always say, well, colic, is something that is just, very serious. It's a problem. They even have some medicines for colic. They largely don't work. They are largely, trying to treat gas, but there's not really been a lot of evidence that supports their use. So one thing to know about colic is they pretty much defined the syndrome. They use what they call the Rome criteria. And I think it's because a group of gastroenterologists wanted to go someplace nice for a holiday so they could plan to make these criteria. But it's kind of like how many hours a day are they crying? How long has this been going on? There's kind of this group of threes. And so again, it's 3 hours and it's for 3 months. And so that's kind of the official sort of definition of colic. But again, not a lot of support. And by 3 months, it tends to largely get better. Okay, so what are some other things that you kind of wanted to know?
Well, what should mothers do if perhaps they figured out the issue or think they know what the issue is, but the baby keeps crying?
Well, I think actually this is something kind of important to know too, because you get a lot of behaviorists, and that's a field of study that has largely died out everywhere else except for here. And this is what comes up in the sleep training literature as well. This idea that we need to sort of extinguish crying. And that is actually the terminology they use. Hardcore behaviorists talk about that. We need to get rid of crying instead of thinking more like what the attachment, kind of theorists think about is like, well, is the baby's attachment figure answering this signal? And the evolutionary psychologist looking at that and saying, what is this doing in terms of baby survival? Are they trying to signal because there's something going on that could actually impair their survival? So it's kind of a different thing. So people kind of have this idea about, what do you kind of do about crying? And I think kind of the most important thing to know, this is something we've learned from a lot of research, is that especially newborns cannot regulate crying on their own. They actually need somebody outside of themselves to co-regulate these strong emotions. Okay, and so basically that doesn't mean the mom cries, the baby cries. That means somebody's there with them, holding them. They might be still crying, and you can still be walking across the floor, you can still be driving in the car, but somebody's with them, holding them, saying, "Yeah, I'm here for you," talking to them, and that helps them co-regulate. And it turns out that's a really important thing to learn how to do as an infant, is to regulate your emotions. And you learn to do that because an adult in the first months of your life helped you learn how to do that. Okay, so that's why that's really important, because you'll be, well, it's not working, I'm doing this and it's not working. Well, it's doing something else, which is helping your baby learn how to do it themselves, how to get themselves out of that really negative space. And you're going to find children are going to kind of need that adult assistance, kind of really throughout childhood, but especially in this newborn period, it's really important. And what the main thing is when you're kind of like with them, even when they're crying, you're lowering their stress levels, you're lowering those cortisol levels, and that is super important.
Now, what are some of the long-term consequences for excessive crying?
Okay, well, so crying itself doesn't necessarily cause consequences. Okay, but what happens is I think it would say unanswered crying. So if people insist on doing this extinction thing, I do believe there are some long-term consequences. And the one that people kind of worry about immediately in the short term is that we know that babies that cry, and especially if they don't get any assistance, often find that their cortisol levels are really, really high. And I think probably one of the best articles I ever read about this was back in the 90s. And you know what? The science on this has not changed. Okay, so a guy made by the name of Robert Sapolsky wrote an article back in 1990 in the journal Science. And he said it was called Why Stress is Bad for Your Brain. And what they were talking about actually was really adults. Okay. And so they were noticing that adults that had chronic depression or chronic post-traumatic stress disorder had smaller hippocampi. Okay. So it was a structure, kind of, sort of wraps around like a little seahorse, around it's part of the limbic system, but it's involved in learning and memory. Okay. And so again, kind of an important thing to have in your adult life. And it's why sometimes if you're really depressed, you have trouble concentrating. You can't concentrate, and it's largely because this hippocampi gets sort of shrunk. And he said, even when you look in like what they call an in vitro study, which means you put, little hippocampi cells in a petri dish and you drop cortisol on them, they shrink. Okay, so this was looking at adults. Now, apply that to the very fragile and very malleable infant brain. Do you think exposing that malleable infant brain to high levels of cortisol is a good idea? What are you doing to that baby long term? That rate for me right there, that raises the whole question. That's why you don't leave a baby's cry unanswered. Even if you're trying to get other people involved, you get other people helping, do that. It's okay for you to take breaks. You don't want to get to the point where you just can't stand it anymore. But bring people around you, take a break, get out of the house, go out, walk around the neighborhood with your baby in some kind of sling, do that. But it really is very important that you don't just let babies cry. Do not listen to people tell you that. After you've eliminated feeding and pain as causes, and you're thinking maybe it's temperament, there's something sensitive. I mean, obviously, you want to make sure they're changed, that there's nothing, that they're not too hot, that they don't have something poking at them. And especially high sensitivity babies, they don't want a bunch of labels and itchy seams and stuff in their clothing, that they're sensitive to it. So kind of eliminate all that stuff, but be there because you're going to help them regulate and bring in the troops. Anybody who says, I need help, I want to help, bring them in and have them help. And the breastfeeding, if you are breastfeeding, breastfeeding is going to help with this because it calms, it dampers down that stress system, and it maybe, it takes a little bit before you get everything going. I would say, definitely bring in a lactation consultant if you need help. If you don't get good answers, go get another one. Seriously, you want to get the answers that you need, not somebody who just looks and says, yeah, well, it's fine. Okay, but you're going to try to rally and you're going to do that.
All right. Is
So
there anything else you might want to tell mothers or the people who work with them, like any kind of final thoughts or assurances?
Yeah, I would say this. One article I'd recommend reading if you kind of are interested in this, but maybe let's get you through the crisis first. But it's an article that's available online. It's called The Dangers of Crying It Out by Darsha Navarez at Notre Dame. Fantastic article. She gives all the science about it and she talks about this central sensitization. But I want to say this. It's not your fault. Baby's not trying to manipulate you. They don't have the cognitive ability to do that. They're trying to signal they want you more than anybody else, but it is okay to bring in other people to help you with this. Okay, and you will get this sorted. I promise you will get through this. It gets easier. And what you want to do is bring in people, but really don't think this is you. There could be a lot of other things and reasons why this baby's crying, but kind of put on your detective hat now and see if you can kind of figure out, okay, what makes a difference? Just be careful about things like don't change, like your perfume, or don't change something that's going to radically, and the baby kind of gets upset because they think, oh, this isn't mom. Just kind of be aware of that, be aware of surroundings, try to be in calm situations, try to keep yourself calm, which means if you need to go take a break, but make sure somebody's there caring for your baby. Okay. But do that. You're gonna get through this. I promise you will. Not your fault, and I know you'll figure it out. I have every confidence in you. And be sure and reach out to people around you to help, give a hand, and don't be afraid to ask for help. But if it doesn't feel like good help to you, go on to the next person. Okay. And so with that, I think Ken will kind of wrap up.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That was very informative. And to all of our viewers, we hope you enjoyed this session and keep an eye out for the next part that will be published very soon. Once again, thank you very much for listening and have a lovely day.